So let me first quickly tell you the difference between disaster recovery and business continuity, although they are used together almost always, and people don't really mean any difference between them when they use these terms in their day-to-day work life. But there is a slight difference, okay? And especially for the CISSP exam, you should know this difference. So first of all, let's talk about disaster recovery. What exactly is disaster recovery? So the purpose of disaster recovery, as the name says, is to recover from disaster. So whenever a disaster strikes to a company, for example, a big event like an earthquake or maybe a fire at some site, at some facility, that is a disaster, right? So what you do immediately after the disaster to recover your operations, to recover your business, that comes under disaster recovery. So who do you call? How do you make sure that the people remain safe in the facility? How do you make sure that your business is least impacted because of that disaster? How do you do that? All of those things come under disaster recovery. Okay, so as it says here, things to do right after a disaster strikes, that is what comes under disaster recovery. And most of the times, because just about all of the businesses these days are very heavily dependent on IT, disaster recovery also tends to be very, very IT focused. Okay, so that is disaster recovery. The things that you do immediately after a disaster to help your business recover from it. Then we have business continuity. What is business continuity? In business continuity, we take a broader approach. We take a much bigger approach, a much wider approach than what we take in disaster recovery. So business continuity is about making sure that your business continues in the long run, that it does not get interrupted, that it does not get severely impacted because of a disaster. Okay, so disaster recovery is like, okay, a disaster happened, now what do we do? What do we do next to make sure that the business is up and running as soon as possible? But business continuity says, okay, all right, yes, a disaster happened. Now, how do we make sure that we are still functioning 6 months from now? We are still functioning 3 months from now. So it takes a much broader approach than just DRP. DRP is focused on the immediate efforts, but business continuity takes a longer approach. Okay, so it focuses on creating the right policies, the right processes and procedures, so that if a disruptive event happens, it has minimal impact on business. So for example, it also involves communicating with customers, like, right? You don't have to communicate with the customers or the media right away, but you need to have some plan in place so that you can send regular updates to the customers. You can inform the media or your partners or any other relevant people, relevant parties. So all of those things come under business continuity. So that is that slight difference between disaster recovery, DR, and BCP. Okay. Now, what are the different steps that come under BCP, business continuity planning? Now, there is NIST, as I said, there is this a department called NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that creates various standards for US federal organizations, for US government organizations. So if you are a US government organization, then you must comply with the documentation that is created by NIST, that the requirements that are created by NIST. So NIST has also created some requirements, some steps for BCP, which are outlined in the document, which is numbered 834. So if you are a US federal company, then you must comply with all of these steps. But because these steps are so good, other companies, whether they are US government companies or not, they also tend to follow these steps that are defined by NIST. Okay, so what are those steps that come under BCP? Let's take a look. So there are 7 steps. First one is creating a continuity policy. Okay, so you don't just start working on business continuity right away. You need to take a bigger approach, right? You need to think long term, and when you are thinking long term, you have to think about creating the right policies. You have to define the scope and the role as well, right? The goals of the overall program. So what do I mean by that? Let me explain you a little bit more here. So before you can embark on the process, embark on the journey of BCP, business continuity planning, you have to first of all define the scope, right? Now, most of the organizations that start this journey of BCP, they don't start with the scope of covering the entire organization right away. They usually start small, and then they start expanding the scope maybe every year or every couple of years, right? Because BCP it's not easy to implement it right away. So you need to take small steps in the beginning. So as it says here, step number 1 is to create a policy to define what is it that you're going to be doing as part of business continuity, who will be responsible for what, who will be overseeing the program, will it be the director of IT or will it be the VP of information security. So you provide all of those details in the policy, and then in the policy you also tell what will be the scope of our BCP, what all parts of the organization will be covered. For example, you may have some data centers spread across the world. Okay, your company may have some data centers spread across the world. Now you may have one data center in US, one data center in Singapore, one data center in India, one in Australia, for example. Now in the beginning, when you are just creating the BCP plan, when you're just starting to create it, then you may say that, all right, let's begin small. So let's first focus on the critical data centers, which are, let's say, US data center and the Singapore data center. So that means you are now defining the scope of the BCP plan, right? Of the business continuity plan. So that is the scope. That means you are defining that, hey, let's focus only on US data center and the Singapore data center as of now. So that is where you define the scope, and then you define the role and the goals as well. And once you have done it, then you present it to your senior management and tell them that, hey, this is what we're going to be doing. This is what we're going to be covering. We need your approval. And once the management gives the approval, then you move ahead with the rest of the steps. So that is step number one, defining the policy, creating the policy, defining the scope, getting the necessary approvals, and then moving on to step number two. What is that step number two? Step number two is conduct business impact analysis, BIA. It's a very, very critical step here. So what is business impact analysis? So as the name says, it is about analyzing the impact to the business. So if something were to happen to your business, or maybe some part of the business, what will be the impact? That is what the BIA is about. Or in other words, you could also say that you need to identify here in BIA, business impact analysis, what is it that could really impact your business? What are the different activities that if they are not available, then your business would be severely impacted? So that comes under business impact analysis. Okay, what could impact your business? So what are the different activities that come under BIA? First one is identify critical activities, processes, systems, functions. Okay, so what do I mean by this? It means that your business has got different departments, different functions, different activities, different processes, right? And not all of those functions or activities are equal in nature. Some are more critical, some are less critical, some generate more revenue, some generate less revenue. So all of them are not equal. So during BIA, what you do is you identify what are the really critical activities, what are the really critical business functions, what are the critical processes that if that will have a very, very severe impact on business if they were to go down or if they were to be impacted. That is what you do as first step of BIA. Okay, once you have done that, once you have identified those critical activities or business functions, then you move to the next step, which is identify the resources that critical activities depend upon. Okay, so for example, let's say you said that in first step number one, you said that, hey, we are a manufacturing company and our manufacturing factory in, for example, Pune is really critical. If that manufacturing facility were to go down or were to be not available for, let's say, 6 hours or 8 hours, then it will mean a huge impact to the revenue. So that will be the first step, right? Identifying the critical activity or a process or a function. Then the second step is identifying the resources that those critical activities depend on. So what is it that your critical manufacturing facility in Pune depends on? Maybe it depends on people, maybe it depends on power, maybe it depends on water, maybe it depends on a certain resource, or maybe a certain vendor from which you get some raw material, right? Because without which your manufacturing facility will not be able to produce the goods. So you have to identify all of those resources that your critical activities depend upon in this step. Once you have identified those critical resources, then you move to the next step, which is calculating MTD, RTO, RPO for resources. So what is MTD, RTO, RPO? I'll get to that shortly. But as of now, I'm just giving you an overview of all of those steps so that you remember all of those steps logically. Okay. So now you have identified the critical activities. You've identified the critical resources that those critical activities depend upon. Now you need to check for how long can your critical activity remain unavailable? For how long can those critical resources remain unavailable? So you may say that, all right, if our manufacturing facility is not available for 2 hours, maybe we can still maybe we can still bounce back. But if it remains for longer than 2 hours, then that could cripple the business. That could mean a significant loss for the business. So that is where you come up with these terms and these numbers, which are MTD, RTO, and RPO, as I said, which I will be covering very shortly. And then finally you decide, okay, now we know what is critical, what are the various dependencies, and for how long we can live without those dependencies or without those critical activities. But what is it that could cause problems for those critical activities, for those dependencies? What are the different threats, or what are the various vulnerabilities for those critical functions, for those critical activities, that could cause them to become unavailable or be impacted? Okay. And then you calculate the risk. You say, all right, this is one of the threats. Maybe the workers of the factory could go on strike, right? That is one of the threats. Now, but what is the likelihood? Maybe it hasn't happened in the last 10 years, so the likelihood could be really low. So that is where you calculate the risk, right? You calculate the probability and the impact, and that is when you come up with the risk factor. Okay. That comes under BIA, step number 2. Now, once you have conducted BIA, then you move on to the third step, which is identify preventive controls. So now you have defined the scope, then you have performed business impact analysis, you have identified the critical activities, the dependencies, and what could impact those dependencies, how long can you remain without those dependencies. Now you need to prevent those things from happening. Now you need to prevent those threats and vulnerabilities from materializing, right? So that is what comes under step number 3, which is where you identify preventive controls. So you try to implement some measures, you implement some processes, or maybe some controls in place, so that those critical activities do not go down, so that those threats and vulnerabilities that you had identified in step number 2, so that they don't materialize. Okay, for example, if you think that a vendor is very critical for the operation of your manufacturing facility, then maybe you could say that, all right, let's have another backup vendor, so that if the primary vendor is not available, then we can at least have the second vendor as well that is available to us. That is a preventive control, right? So you try to mitigate the impact in this third step. Then the fourth step is create contingency strategies. Just because you have identified or implemented some preventive controls in step number 3 does not mean that those contingencies or those problems will not occur. They can still occur. No matter how many preventive controls you put in place, there will always be a risk. Risk is never reduced to zero, right? So you still need to have some plan in place, that if problems still occur, if something still goes wrong despite putting in all of those preventive controls, then what do we do? Then how do we recover? So this is what you do here in step number 4. You identify recovery mechanisms and strategies. So how do you recover it, and what are the different steps that you will need to take? That comes under step number 4. Okay. So you talk about business process recovery here, your facility recovery, your supply and technology recovery, user environment recovery, data recovery. All those things come under step number 4. For example, if you have, let's say, 2 ISPs, let's say you identify that your connectivity to the data center is really critical. In that case, you can have 2 ISPs, right? But if both the ISPs are down, which is a possibility, then how do you recover from that? That is what comes under step number 4. Okay. Then comes step number 5, which is develop BCP. This is where we are talking about documentation. This is where we are talking about documentation, like documenting the strategies that we have discussed so far. You perform the business impact analysis, what activities were identified, what were the dependencies that were identified, what controls are you planning to put, what contingency strategies are you planning to implement. All of those things have to be documented, right? So that is what comes under development of BCP. And then you have to create copies of the plans as well. You can't just create one plan and keep it at one place. What if you lose it in that disaster? So you have to create multiple copies of the plans, and then you have to also document the call tree, like who will be called at what time and at what stage. So that is what you do under step number 5, which is development of BCP. Okay. And then we are reaching step number 6, sorry, which is plan, testing, training, exercises, and drills, which is regular testing. So just because you have created a plan, that is never sufficient, right? Because things can always go haywire when things actually happen. So having a plan is good, but you also need to test that plan, and that too regularly. So this is what comes under step number 6. And then we have step number 7, which is maintenance of the plan. Just because you have created a plan once, it is not sufficient, because organizations are dynamic. They keep changing. People keep changing the roles. Today, maybe someone is heading the department of BCP. Tomorrow, it may be somebody else, right? So you have to make sure that your plan is updated accordingly. People's phone numbers change. They switch roles. They move up and down in the organization. So make sure that your BCP is updated regularly. That is step number 7. So those are the 7 steps of BCP that any organization should take as far as NIST 834 documentation is concerned, and from CISSP's perspective as well. Okay.